A white landlord refuses to rent his property to a black family, but he's shocked when he discovers the truth about his own son's connection to the black family, challenging everything he believed. Mr. Harris stood at the window of his grand office, gazing out at the pristine neighborhood he had built. The manicured lawns and elegant homes filled him with a sense of pride. He had worked hard to create this exclusive community, and he wasn't about to let anyone ruin it. With a contented sigh, he turned back to his desk. His eyes fell on the framed photos of his properties, each one a testament to his success. Mr. Harris ran his fingers over the polished wood, remembering the day he bought his first building. "I've come a long way," he muttered to himself, a small smile playing on his lips. Mr. Harris had always believed in maintaining high standards. His rental policies were strict, and he made no apologies for it. In his mind, it was these very policies that kept his properties valuable and desirable. He picked up a stack of rental applications, flipping through them with a critical eye. Each form was carefully screened, ensuring that only the right kind of people would be allowed to live in his buildings. "Can't let just anyone in," he said aloud, his voice firm. "Got to keep things exclusive." Mr. Harris paused, his hand hovering over one particular application. His brow furrowed as he read the name. With a quick shake of his head, he tossed it into the rejection pile. No, he muttered. "Can't have any of them here, it would change the whole atmosphere." A twinge of guilt pricked at his conscience, but he quickly pushed it aside. In his mind, he was doing what was best for his community. He told himself that his other tenants wouldn't want black neighbors. It was better this way, he reasoned. Mr. Harris leaned back in his leather chair, feeling the weight of his decisions. But he hardened his heart, convincing himself that his prejudices were justified. After all, he had built this empire with his own two hands. He had the right to decide who lived here. "It's my property," he said firmly, as if trying to convince an invisible audience. "My rules." The Thompson family gathered around their kitchen table, excitement buzzing in the air. Robert and Lisa sat side by side, their 4 boys, Ethan, Noah, Jacob, and Caleb, crowded around them. On the table lay a stack of papers, the rental application for one of Mr. Harris's properties. "Boys," Robert began, his voice warm and encouraging, "this could be a big step for our family. The new house has more space for all of us to grow." Lisa nodded, her eyes twinkling with hope. "And it's closer to your schools. Imagine not having to wake up so early every morning." The boys exchanged eager glances. Ethan, the oldest, spoke up. "Will we each get our own room, Dad?" Robert chuckled, ruffling Ethan's hair. "Not quite, son, but you'll have more space than you do now." As Robert began filling out the application, Lisa turned to the younger boys. "Noah, Jacob, Caleb, what do you think about the new house?" "I hope it has a big backyard," Noah exclaimed, his eyes wide with excitement. Jacob nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, maybe we can finally get a dog." "One step at a time," Lisa laughed, her heart swelling with love for her family. Caleb, the youngest, climbed onto his mother's lap. "Will we still be close to Grandma and Grandpa?" Lisa hugged him close. "We'll be a little farther away, sweetie, but we'll still visit them often." As Robert finished the application, he looked up at his family. Despite their success in business, they had always chosen to live modestly. This move, while still humble by their means, represented a step towards a better life for their boys. "Now remember," Robert said, his tone gentle but firm, "this house isn't guaranteed. Mr. Harris has to approve our application." Lisa reached out and squeezed his hand. "We've been good tenants everywhere we've lived. I'm sure Mr. Harris will see that." The family huddled together, their hopes high and hearts full of dreams for their potential new home. They were unaware of the challenges that lay ahead, but their love for each other and their faith in goodness shone brightly, ready to face whatever came their way. Mr. Harris sat at his polished mahogany desk, a stack of rental applications before him. His fingers, adorned with a heavy gold ring, tapped impatiently on the wood as he sifted through the papers. When he came across the Thompson family's application, his brow furrowed. He skimmed through the details. Robert and Lisa Thompson, 4 boys. Their income was more than sufficient, their credit scores impeccable. On paper, they were ideal tenants. Mr. Harris's lips pressed into a thin line as he saw the family photo attached to the application. Well, he muttered to himself, his voice low and disapproving. What do we have here? He leaned back in his leather chair, conflict etching lines across his face. The Thompsons met every criterion he had set for his tenants. They were successful, had a stable family, and their references were glowing. But there was one thing Mr. Harris couldn't overlook: their skin color. A voice in the back of his mind whispered that he was being unfair, that rejecting them based on race was wrong. But Mr. Harris pushed the thought away, focusing instead on maintaining what he called the character of his properties. It's about keeping standards, he said aloud, trying to convince himself. It's not personal. With a heavy sigh, Mr. Harris picked up his pen and began writing on the rejection form. He cited vague reasons, concerns about overcrowding with 4 children, worries about noise levels. But deep down, he knew these were just excuses. As he sealed the rejection letter in an envelope, Mr. Harris felt a twinge of guilt. He tried to shake it off, reminding himself of his success, of the exclusive community he had built. Yet the image of the smiling Thompson family lingered in his mind. It's just business, he muttered, dropping the envelope into his outgoing mail tray. But even as he said it, Mr. Harris couldn't quite meet his own eyes in the reflection of his office window. Robert Thompson sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped as he stared at the rejection letter from Mr. Harris. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. A mix of disappointment and frustration etched across his face. Lisa gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. Robert looked up at his wife, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "Mr. Harris rejected our application," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you know what? We don't need his fancy house. We'll build our own home." Lisa's eyes widened. "Build our own home? Are you sure, Robert?" He nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Yes, I am. We'll find a piece of land on the outskirts of town. It might not be as fancy as Mr. Harris's properties, but it'll be ours." Lisa squeezed his shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. "That's my Robert," she said warmly, "always finding a way forward." Robert stood up, drawing Lisa into a tight hug. "It won't be easy," he murmured into her hair, "but we'll make it work. We always do." Lisa pulled back slightly, looking into Robert's eyes. "Remember what we always tell the boys? When life gives you lemons, make lemonade," Robert finished, his smile growing wider. "You're right, honey. We can't let this get us down." As if on cue, their 4 boys, Ethan, Noah, Jacob, and Caleb, tumbled into the kitchen, their faces curious. "What's going on, Dad?" Ethan, the oldest, asked. Robert looked at his sons, his chest swelling with love and pride. "Boys," he said, his voice strong and clear, "we're going to build our own house. It might not be big or fancy, but it'll be ours, and we'll make it a home filled with love." The boys' eyes lit up with excitement. "Can we help, Dad?" Noah asked eagerly. "Of course," Robert laughed. "We'll do it together, as a family." Lisa watched her husband and sons, her heart full of joy and hope. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that together, they could overcome anything. Mark Harris stepped into the gleaming showroom of Elite Motors, his heart pounding with excitement. It was his first day at the luxury car company, and he couldn't wait to start his new job. The polished cars sparkled under the bright lights, their sleek lines promising power and prestige. As Mark made his way to the reception desk, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had landed this job on his own merits without any help from his father's connections. It felt good to stand on his own 2 feet. "Good morning," a friendly voice greeted him. "You must be Mark. I'm Sarah, the HR manager. Welcome to Elite Motors." Mark smiled warmly. "Thank you, Sarah. I'm really excited to be here." Sarah led Mark through the building, introducing him to his new colleagues. As they walked, Mark noticed something different about this workplace. There was a warmth in the air, a sense of camaraderie that he hadn't expected in a luxury car company. "And here's where you'll be working," Sarah said, gesturing to a modern, open-plan office. "Our CEO, Mr. Thompson, believes in fostering a collaborative environment." Mark's eyebrows rose in surprise. "The CEO cares about the work environment?" Sarah nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, yes. Mr. Thompson is very hands-on. He and his wife, Mrs. Thompson, have built this company on strong values. They believe in treating everyone with respect and dignity, from the janitor to the top executives." As the day progressed, Mark found himself more and more impressed. He watched as employees from different departments worked together seamlessly, their interactions marked by mutual respect and genuine friendliness. During his lunch break, Mark overheard two colleagues discussing a recent company initiative. "Can you believe the Thompsons are using part of the profits to fund a community center?" one of them said. "That's just like them," the other replied warmly, "always thinking of ways to give back." Mark felt a wave of admiration wash over him. This was so different from the cutthroat business world his father had always described. Here, success wasn't just about making money, it was about making a difference. As he returned to his desk, Mark caught sight of a framed quote on the wall. "Success is not just about what you accomplish in your life. It's about what you inspire others to do." Mark smiled to himself. He had a feeling he was going to love working here. Over the next few weeks, Mark found himself settling into his new role at Elite Motors. He was impressed by the company's values and the positive work environment. What stood out most to him, though, was the kindness and approachability of the owners, Robert and Lisa Thompson. One afternoon, as Mark was reviewing some paperwork, Robert stopped by his desk. "How's it going, Mark?" he asked with a warm smile. Mark looked up, pleasantly surprised. "It's going great, Mr. Thompson. I'm really enjoying the work here." Robert chuckled. "Please call me Robert. I'm glad to hear you're settling in well. Say, Lisa and I were wondering if you'd like to join us for dinner at our place this Friday. We like to get to know our employees better." Mark felt a surge of excitement. "I'd be honored, sir. Robert. Thank you for the invitation." On Friday evening, Mark drove to the address Robert had given him. As he turned onto a modest street on the outskirts of town, he felt a bit confused. Surely the owners of such a successful company would live in a more upscale neighborhood. His confusion grew as he pulled up to a simple, cozy-looking house. It was well-maintained, but far from the mansion he had expected. Mark double-checked the address, then hesitantly approached the front door. Lisa Thompson answered his knock with a warm smile. "Mark, we're so glad you could make it. Come on in." As Mark stepped inside, he was struck by the homey atmosphere. The house was small but filled with love and laughter. He could hear children playing in another room. Robert appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on an apron. "Welcome, Mark. Hope you're hungry. I've got a mean pot roast in the oven." Mark's surprise must have shown on his face because Lisa laughed softly. "I know it's not what you expected," she said gently. "But we believe in living simply and focusing on what truly matters." As the evening progressed, Mark found himself captivated by the Thompsons' warmth and genuineness. They shared stories about their 4 boys, their business philosophy, and their commitment to giving back to the community. As Mark sat down to dinner with the Thompson family, he was struck by the warmth and love that filled their modest home. The aroma of Robert's pot roast filled the air, mixing with the sound of laughter and cheerful chatter. Lisa called out, "Boys, dinner's ready!" 4 young boys rushed into the dining room, their faces bright with excitement. Mark was impressed by how quickly they settled down and took their seats without fuss. "Mark, let me introduce you to our sons," Robert said proudly. "This is Ethan, our oldest, then Noah, Jacob, and Caleb." Each boy greeted Mark politely, looking him in the eye as they shook his hand. Mark couldn't help but smile at their good manners. As they ate, Mark listened intently to the family's conversation. He was amazed by how articulate and ambitious the boys were. Ethan, the eldest, spoke about his dream of becoming a doctor. "I want to help people in our community who can't afford health care," he explained earnestly. Noah chimed in, "I'm going to be an engineer and design eco-friendly buildings." Jacob, the quieter of the four, shared his passion for writing. "I want to tell stories that bring people together," he said softly. Even little Caleb had big dreams. "I'm going to be a teacher like Mom used to be," he declared, beaming at Lisa. Mark was touched by the boys' aspirations and the evident pride on Robert and Lisa's faces. He noticed how the parents encouraged each child's dreams, offering words of support and guidance. Throughout the meal, Mark observed the family's interactions. Despite their humble surroundings, there was a richness in their relationships that he found deeply moving. The boys helped clear the table without being asked, and the conversation flowed easily, full of respect and genuine interest in each other's lives. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself feeling more and more at home. The Thompsons' warmth and humility were a stark contrast to the world he had grown up in, and he found it refreshing and inspiring. The following evening, Mark joined his parents for dinner at their lavish home. The dining room was elegant, with crystal chandeliers and fine china, but Mark couldn't help comparing it to the warm, inviting atmosphere of the Thompsons' modest home. As they began their meal, Mr. Harris asked, "So, Mark, how's that new job of yours going?" Mark's face lit up. "It's wonderful, Dad. The company is amazing and the owners are incredible people." Mrs. Harris smiled. "That's nice, dear. Tell us more about these owners." "Well, their names are Robert and Lisa Thompson," Mark began, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "They've built this company from the ground up and they treat everyone like family. I had dinner at their house last night, and it was such an eye-opening experience." Mr. Harris froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, a look of unease crossing his face. Mark continued, oblivious to his father's reaction. "They have 4 sons, all so well-mannered and ambitious. The oldest wants to be a doctor, can you believe it? And their home? It's not big or fancy, but it's full of love and warmth." Mr. Harris's face paled. He cleared his throat nervously. "Thompson, you said? Where do they live?" "On the outskirts of town," Mark replied. "They built the house themselves after they couldn't find a place to rent in the area. Isn't that admirable?" Mr. Harris's discomfort was now visible. He shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact with his son. Mrs. Harris, noticing her husband's strange behavior, asked, "Dear, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mr. Harris took a deep breath. "Mark," he said, his voice strained, "this Thompson family, are they black?" Mark's brow furrowed in confusion. "Yes, they are. Why does that matter?" The realization hit Mr. Harris like a ton of bricks. The family his son was praising so highly was the same one he had rejected as tenants. He felt a wave of shame wash over him as he remembered the flimsy excuses he had used to turn them away. As Mark continued to share stories about the Thompson family, Mr. Harris found himself listening with growing interest. Despite his initial discomfort, he couldn't help but be intrigued by the warmth and success Mark described. "Tell me more about Robert," Mr. Harris said, his voice softer than before. "What kind of businessman is he?" Mark's eyes lit up. "He's incredible, Dad. Robert started the company with just a small loan and a big dream. Now he employs over 100 people and treats them all like family." Mr. Harris nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "And the boys? You said they're ambitious?" "Oh, absolutely," Mark replied enthusiastically. "Ethan, the oldest, is already taking advanced classes to prepare for medical school. Noah wants to be an engineer, and the younger 2 are excelling in school too." As Mark spoke, Mr. Harris felt a twinge of guilt in his chest. He had dismissed the Thompsons without giving them a chance, basing his decision solely on the color of their skin. Now, hearing about their accomplishments and character, he began to question his judgment. Mrs. Harris, noticing her husband's pensive mood, asked gently, "What are you thinking, dear?" Mr. Harris sighed deeply. "I'm wondering if I've made a terrible mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked at his father, confusion evident on his face. "What do you mean, Dad?" Mr. Harris hesitated for a moment before speaking. "The Thompsons, they applied to rent one of our properties a while back. I turned them down." Mark's eyes widened in surprise. "But why?" They're such wonderful people. Mr. Harris felt shame wash over him as he realized the full weight of his actions. He had let his prejudices cloud his judgment, potentially depriving his community of a remarkable family. "I think I need to reconsider some things," Mr. Harris said quietly, more to himself than to his family. He looked up at Mark, a mix of regret and curiosity in his eyes. "Tell me more about them, son. I want to understand." As the days passed, Robert Thompson and Mark Harris found themselves growing closer at work. Their friendship blossomed naturally, built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect. One sunny afternoon during their lunch break, Robert and Mark sat in the company's small garden area. The warm breeze rustled through the leaves of a nearby oak tree as they enjoyed their sandwiches. "You know, Mark," Robert began, his eyes twinkling with warmth, "I've been meaning to tell you how much I appreciate your friendship. It's not often you find someone who truly understands the value of hard work and kindness." Mark smiled, touched by Robert's words. "I feel the same way, Robert. I've learned so much from you in such a short time." Robert nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "That's what life's all about, isn't it? Learning and growing. It's something I try to instill in my boys every day." Curious, Mark leaned forward. "How do you do that? I mean, with all your success, it must be challenging to keep them grounded." Robert chuckled softly. "It's not always easy, that's for sure. But Lisa and I believe it's crucial to teach them humility and kindness above all else." He paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. "We could afford a much bigger house or fancier cars, but we choose to live simply. We want the boys to understand that true wealth isn't about material possessions." Mark listened intently, fascinated by Robert's approach to parenting. "Every weekend," Robert went on, his voice filled with pride, "we volunteer at the local soup kitchen. The boys serve food, chat with the people there, and learn that everyone has a story worth hearing." "That's amazing," Mark said, genuinely impressed. "I bet it's had a real impact on them." Robert nodded, his eyes misting slightly. "It has. Just last week, Ethan used his allowance to buy a warm coat for a homeless man he'd befriended at the kitchen. He didn't tell us about it. We found out from the shelter coordinator." Mark felt a lump form in his throat, moved by the story. "You must be so proud." "I am," Robert admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But more than that, I'm grateful. Grateful that we can provide for our family while still teaching our boys the importance of giving back and treating everyone with respect." As the days grew warmer, Mr. Harris found himself spending more time on his front porch, sipping iced tea and watching the neighborhood. His thoughts often drifted to the Thompson family, their story weighing heavily on his mind. One sunny afternoon, Mr. Harris noticed a commotion down the street. Squinting his eyes, he saw Mrs. Johnson, an elderly neighbor, struggling with her groceries. Before he could even consider helping, two young boys appeared at her side. "Those are the Thompson boys," Mr. Harris muttered to himself, recognizing Ethan and Noah from Mark's descriptions. He watched intently as the boys carefully took Mrs. Johnson's bags, their smiles bright and genuine. They chatted animatedly with her as they carried the groceries into her house. Mr. Harris felt a twinge of surprise at their politeness. A few days later, Mr. Harris was driving through town when he spotted Jacob and Caleb, the younger Thompson boys, picking up litter in the park. They worked diligently, laughing and racing each other to see who could fill their trash bag first. Mr. Harris slowed his car, watching the scene unfold. He couldn't help but notice how other children joined in, inspired by the Thompson boys' initiative. The park, which had been littered with candy wrappers and soda cans, was soon spotless. As the days passed, Mr. Harris found himself paying more attention to the Thompson boys' actions in the community. He saw Ethan helping a lost dog find its way home, Noah tutoring younger kids at the library, and all four boys volunteering at various community events. Each small act of kindness and respect he witnessed chipped away at Mr. Harris's long-held prejudices. He began to question the beliefs that had seemed so solid just weeks ago. The boys' behavior stood in stark contrast to the assumptions he'd made about their family. One evening, as Mr. Harris sat on his porch, he saw the Thompson family walking together, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. He watched as they stopped to help a neighbor whose car had broken down, working together to push it to the side of the road. In that moment, Mr. Harris felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. He realized that he had judged this family based solely on the color of their skin, missing the true measure of their character. His prejudice, once so firm, now felt shaky and unfounded. Mark Harris couldn't contain his excitement as he approached his parents' house. He knocked on the door, his face beaming with enthusiasm. When Mr. Harris opened it, Mark burst out, "Mom, Dad, I have great news." Mrs. Harris appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it, dear?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Mark took a deep breath and announced, "The company is hosting a big event next weekend, and I'd love for you both to come. It's a chance to meet everyone and see where I work." Mr. Harris's face immediately fell, his brow furrowing with concern. "I don't know, son. You know how I feel about these social gatherings?" Mark's smile faltered for a moment, but he pressed on. "Please, Dad. It would mean so much to me. You've always talked about wanting to understand my work better." Mrs. Harris placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "I think it's a wonderful idea. We should support Mark, dear." Mr. Harris looked from his wife to his son, seeing the hope in their eyes. He sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping in resignation. All right, we'll go." Mark's face lit up with joy. "Thanks, Dad. You won't regret it. I promise." As the day of the event approached, Mr. Harris grew increasingly anxious. He paced around the house, muttering about crowds and small talk. Mrs. Harris watched him with a mixture of amusement and concern. On the evening of the gathering, Mr. Harris stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. His wife came up behind him, smoothing out his jacket. "It'll be fine, dear," she reassured him. "Mark is so excited to have us there." Mr. Harris nodded, trying to calm his nerves. I know. I'm doing this for him." As they drove to the event, Mark chatted excitedly about his colleagues and the company's recent achievements. Mr. Harris listened silently, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When they arrived at the venue, Mark led his parents inside, his eyes scanning the room. Suddenly, he waved enthusiastically. "There's Robert and Lisa. Come on, I want you to meet them." Mr. Harris froze, his eyes widening in recognition. There, across the room, stood the very family he had once refused to rent to. His heart raced as Mark guided them towards the Thompsons, oblivious to the connection. As Mark led his parents across the room, Mr. Harris felt his heart pounding in his chest. The crowd seemed to part, revealing Robert and Lisa Thompson standing near a beautifully decorated table. Mr. Harris swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "Mom, Dad, I'd like you to meet Robert and Lisa Thompson," Mark said, beaming with pride. "They own the company I work for." Robert extended his hand, a warm smile lighting up his face. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Harris. Mark has told us so much about you." Mr. Harris hesitated for a moment before taking Robert's hand. The handshake was firm and genuine, catching him off guard. "Likewise," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa stepped forward, her eyes twinkling with kindness. "We're so glad you could make it tonight. Mark is such a wonderful addition to our team." As they exchanged pleasantries, Mr. Harris couldn't help but notice the way others in the room looked at Robert and Lisa. There was a palpable sense of respect and admiration in the air. Employees approached the Thompsons with ease, sharing jokes and stories. A young intern rushed up to Robert looking flustered. "Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a small issue with the catering." Robert turned to the intern, his voice calm and reassuring. "Don't worry, Sarah. Let's see what we can do to help." He excused himself politely, leaving Mr. Harris stunned by his approachability. Lisa engaged Mrs. Harris in conversation, asking thoughtful questions about their family and interests. Mr. Harris watched in amazement as his wife relaxed, laughing at Lisa's gentle humor. Throughout the evening, Mr. Harris observed the Thompsons interacting with guests and employees alike. They remembered names, asked about families, and showed genuine interest in everyone they spoke to. The respect they commanded was evident, yet it was clear that it came from a place of kindness and integrity rather than authority. As the night wore on, Mr. Harris found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about the Thompsons. The prejudices that had once seemed so certain now felt shaky and unfounded. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of shame for his past actions. As the evening progressed, Mr. Harris found himself drawn into a conversation with Robert Thompson. They stood near a window overlooking the city lights, each holding a glass of sparkling water. "Your company seems to be doing very well," Mr. Harris remarked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Robert nodded, a humble smile on his face. "We've been blessed, that's for sure. But success isn't just about money, you know?" Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, how do you mean?" Robert took a sip of his drink before continuing. "Lisa and we made a decision early on. We wanted our boys to understand the value of hard work and simplicity. But surely with your success you could afford a more comfortable lifestyle?" Mr. Harris probed, thinking of the modest home he had observed. Robert's eyes twinkled. "We could, but we choose not to. Our home might be small, but it's filled with love. We want our boys to know that true wealth comes from within." Mr. Harris felt a pang of guilt, remembering his hasty judgment of the Thompsons' rental application. "That's admirable," he said softly. "You see," Robert continued, "we believe in leading by example. Our boys see us working hard, giving back to the community. We want them to understand that success is about more than just accumulating wealth." As Robert spoke, Mr. Harris found himself reassessing his own values. He thought of his own son, Mark, and how impressed he had been with the Thompsons' family dynamic. "But don't you worry about your children missing out?" Mr. Harris asked, voicing a concern he didn't even realize he had. Robert shook his head, his expression serene. "Missing out on what? They have everything they need: love, education, and strong values. We're teaching them to be kind, to work hard, and to help others. In our eyes, that's the greatest wealth we can give them." Mr. Harris fell silent, mulling over Robert's words. He thought about his own life, his big house, his expensive cars. For the first time, he wondered if he had been measuring success all wrong. The next evening, Mr. Harris sat in his study, lost in thought. The conversation with Robert Thompson had stirred something deep within him. As he gazed out the window, he heard a soft knock on the door. "Come in," he called out. Mark entered, a concerned look on his face. "Dad? Is everything okay? You've been quiet since the event." Mr. Harris sighed, gesturing for his son to take a seat. "Mark, I've been doing some thinking about our values, about what really matters in life." Mark leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean, Dad?" "I've always thought success was about wealth, status, and keeping the right people around us," Mr. Harris began, his voice heavy with emotion. "But now I'm not so sure." Mark nodded encouragingly, sensing his father's inner struggle. "Son, tell me more about the Thompsons," Mr. Harris said softly. "What is it about them that impresses you so much?" Mark's eyes lit up. "Oh, Dad, they're amazing. Robert and Lisa, they're so humble despite their success. And their boys, you should see how respectful and hardworking they are." Mr. Harris listened intently as Mark continued. "The Thompsons, they don't just talk about values, they live them," Mark explained. "They teach their kids that true wealth comes from kindness and helping others. It's inspiring, really." Mr. Harris felt a lump form in his throat. "And you admire that?" "I do, Dad," Mark replied earnestly. "It's made me think about what really matters in life. Integrity, humility, compassion, those are the things that make a person truly successful." Mr. Harris nodded slowly, his son's words sinking in. "You know, Mark, I think I've been wrong about a lot of things. I've judged people based on things that don't really matter." Mark reached out and patted his father's hand. "It's never too late to change, Dad. The Thompsons have shown me that. They've taught me so much about what it means to be a good person." As Mr. Harris looked into his son's eyes, he saw a wisdom and compassion that filled him with pride. He realized that Mark had learned lessons that he himself was only now beginning to understand. Mr. Harris sat in his study long after Mark had left, his mind churning with conflicting emotions. The weight of his past actions pressed heavily upon him, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of genuine remorse. He thought back to the day he had rejected the Thompsons' rental application. At the time, it had seemed so simple, so justified. But now, as he recalled the flimsy reasons he had given, shame washed over him like a cold wave. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room. Mr. Harris stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the manicured lawns of his exclusive community. Once he had taken pride in the uniformity, the perceived perfection. Now it all seemed hollow and meaningless. He thought of Robert Thompson, a man who had built a successful business from nothing, who taught his children the value of hard work and humility. And Lisa Thompson, whose warmth and kindness had touched even Mark's heart. Mr. Harris realized with a pang that he had denied his community the richness of their presence. "I judged them without knowing them," he said aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "I let my prejudice blind me to their character." The guilt gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing moment. He thought of the simple home the Thompsons had built on the outskirts of town, forced there by his narrow-mindedness. How different things might have been if he had given them a chance. Mr. Harris sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He had always prided himself on being a successful businessman, a pillar of the community. But now, he saw the hollowness of those achievements. What good was wealth if it came at the cost of one's humanity? "I've been so wrong," he murmured, tears pricking at his eyes. So terribly wrong. As the reality of his actions sank in, Mr. Harris felt a deep sense of loss. He had missed out on knowing a remarkable family, on enriching his community with their presence. More than that, he had denied himself the opportunity to grow, to see beyond his prejudices. The guilt was overwhelming, but with it came a glimmer of something else, a desire to make things right, to be better. Mr. Harris knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Perhaps it wasn't too late to change, to learn from his mistakes. Robert and Mark sat in the company's break room, sharing a quiet moment over cups of steaming coffee. The bustling office seemed far away as Robert leaned in, his voice low and sincere. "You know, Mark," Robert began, his eyes distant with memory, "building our home wasn't easy. There were times when we almost gave up." Mark listened intently, his coffee forgotten as he absorbed every word. Robert continued, "After your father turned down our rental application, we were heartbroken. But Lisa, bless her heart, she said, 'Robert, we'll make our own home. It'll be filled with love. And that's what matters.'" Mark felt a pang of guilt at the mention of his father, but he remained silent, eager to hear more. "We found that plot on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was ours," Robert said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Every day after work, I'd go there and clear the land. The boys would join me when they could, even little Caleb trying to carry twigs bigger than himself." Robert's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "There were nights when my hands were so blistered I could barely hold a fork, but Lisa would patch me up and we'd all pray together, thanking God for what we had." Mark felt a lump forming in his throat. He could picture the Thompsons, united in their struggle, facing each challenge with grace and determination. "The hardest part," Robert continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "was when the first winter storm hit. We hadn't finished the roof yet. I'll never forget huddling with Lisa and the boys under a tarp, rain leaking through, all of us shivering." Mark's heart ached at the image. He reached out and placed a comforting hand on Robert's shoulder. "But you know what?" Robert said, his voice growing stronger. "Not once did we consider giving up. Every setback just made us more determined. And when we finally moved in, it wasn't just a house. It was a home we had built with our own hands, with our love and our faith." Mark felt overwhelmed by the Thompson family's resilience. Their unwavering spirit in the face of adversity touched him deeply. He realized that true strength wasn't about wealth or status, but about facing life's challenges with dignity and perseverance. Mark stood in the kitchen of the Harris family home, nervously adjusting the silverware on the dining table. He glanced at his father, Mr. Harris, who was pacing back and forth in the living room. "Dad, relax," Mark said softly. "They're just people like us. Mr. Harris stopped pacing and looked at his son. His eyes were filled with a mix of anxiety and determination. "I know, son. I want to make things right." The doorbell rang and both men jumped slightly. Mark took a deep breath and went to answer the door. As he opened it, he was greeted by the warm smiles of the Thompson family. "Welcome," Mark said, his voice filled with genuine happiness. "Please, come in." Robert and Lisa Thompson entered first, followed by their 4 boys, Ethan, Noah, Jacob, and Caleb. Each of them carried a dish, filling the air with delicious aromas. Mr. Harris stepped forward, his hands slightly shaking. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so glad you could join us tonight." Robert extended his hand, his eyes kind and understanding. "Thank you for having us, Mr. Harris. We're honored to be here." As they shook hands, Mr. Harris felt a wave of shame wash over him. He remembered his past prejudices and the pain he had caused this family. But in Robert's eyes, he saw no judgment, only warmth. Lisa stepped forward, offering Mr. Harris a homemade apple pie. "We hope you like dessert," she said with a gentle smile. Mr. Harris accepted the pie, his eyes misting over. That's very kind of you. Thank you." As they moved to the dining room, the Harris home began to fill with the chatter and laughter of the Thompson boys. Caleb, the youngest, tugged on Mr. Harris's sleeve. "Mr. Harris," he said, his eyes wide with innocence, "did you know that my daddy built our whole house?" Mr. Harris knelt down to Caleb's level, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what this family had been through because of his actions. "Is that so?" he said softly. "Your daddy must be very skilled and hardworking." Caleb nodded enthusiastically. "He is, and Mommy says our house is special 'cause it's built with love." Mr. Harris felt a lump form in his throat. He looked up at Robert and Lisa, who were watching the interaction with gentle smiles. In that moment, he realized the true strength of the family he had once judged so harshly. As they all took their seats at the table, Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "Before we begin," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I'd like to say something." As the dinner progressed, the conversation flowed easily around the table. The Thompson boys shared stories about their school and hobbies, while Mark and Lisa discussed work at the luxury car company. Mr. Harris, however, found himself drawn into a deep conversation with Robert Thompson. "You know, Mr. Thompson," Mr. Harris began, his voice soft and thoughtful, "I must admit, I'm impressed by the values you've instilled in your family." Robert smiled warmly. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. Lisa and I believe that strong values are the foundation of a good life." Mr. Harris nodded, his eyes filled with a newfound respect. "I can see that. Your boys are so well-mannered and ambitious. How do you manage it?" Robert took a sip of water before answering. "It's not always easy," he admitted. "But we believe in leading by example. We try to show our boys the importance of hard work, kindness, and humility." As Robert spoke, Mr. Harris found himself leaning in, hanging on every word. He thought about his own life, his own choices, and felt a pang of regret. "And what about your decision to live simply?" Mr. Harris asked, genuinely curious. "I mean, you own a successful company, yet you choose to live modestly. Why is that?" Robert's eyes twinkled as he glanced at his wife and sons. "We want our boys to understand that true wealth isn't about money or possessions. It's about family, community, and making a positive difference in the world." Mr. Harris felt something shift inside him. He looked around the table at the laughing, chattering group and saw not just a family, but a community he had once tried to exclude. "Community," Mr. Harris repeated softly. "I'm beginning to see how important that really is." Robert nodded, his expression serious but kind. "A strong community lifts everyone up, Mr. Harris. When we support each other, regardless of our differences, we all benefit." As the conversation continued, Mr. Harris felt a growing respect for Robert Thompson. He saw before him a man of integrity, wisdom, and compassion, qualities that had nothing to do with the color of his skin. As the dinner came to a close, a hush fell over the table. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, his eyes filled with emotion. He looked at Robert and Lisa Thompson, his heart heavy with the weight of his past actions. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice quivering slightly. I owe you both an apology." The Thompsons exchanged a surprised glance, while Mark looked on with curiosity. Mr. Harris took a deep breath and continued, "When you applied to rent one of my properties, I rejected your application, and I did it for all the wrong reasons." Lisa reached out and placed her hand on Robert's arm, offering silent support. "I was prejudiced," Mr. Harris admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I judged you based on the color of your skin, not on the content of your character, and I was so wrong." Tears welled up in Mr. Harris's eyes as he spoke. "Getting to know you and your family has opened my eyes. You've shown me what true integrity, kindness, and family values look like. I'm deeply ashamed of my actions, and I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me." The room was silent for a moment. Robert and Lisa looked at each other, a wordless conversation passing between them. Then Robert turned to Mr. Harris with a gentle smile. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice warm and sincere, "we appreciate your honesty. It takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes." Lisa nodded in agreement. "We've all had moments we're not proud of," she added softly. "What matters is how we learn and grow from them." Mr. Harris looked at them in disbelief, overwhelmed by their graciousness. "You're willing to forgive me? Just like that?" Robert reached across the table and placed a hand on Mr. Harris's shoulder. "Forgiveness is a choice, Mr. Harris, and it's one we're happy to make. Your apology means a lot to us." Tears of relief and gratitude streamed down Mr. Harris's face. He felt as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. In that moment, he knew his life would never be the same. The following day, Mr. Harris woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of his guilt had been lifted, but he felt a strong urge to do more. He wanted to make things right with the Thompson family in a tangible way. After much thought, he decided to offer them the rental property they had initially applied for. It was a beautiful house, much larger and more comfortable than their current home. Mr. Harris hoped this gesture would show the sincerity of his apology and his desire to make amends. With a mixture of nervousness and determination, Mr. Harris picked up the phone and dialed Robert Thompson's number. When Robert answered, Mr. Harris took a deep breath and explained his offer. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice filled with earnestness, "I'd like to offer you and your family the rental property you originally applied for. It's still available, and I'd be honored if you'd consider it." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Robert spoke, his voice warm but firm. "Mr. Harris, I truly appreciate your offer. It's very kind of you. But Lisa and I need to decline." Mr. Harris felt a pang of disappointment. "May I ask why?" he inquired gently. Robert chuckled softly. "You see, Mr. Harris, the home we built, it's more than just a house to us. It's a testament to our family's values and hard work. We've poured our hearts into it, and it's where we've created so many precious memories with our boys." Lisa's voice chimed in as Robert had put the call on speakerphone. "Our home might be simple," she added, "but it's filled with love and laughter. It's exactly where we want to be." Mr. Harris listened, a lump forming in his throat. He was moved by the Thompsons' contentment and their strong sense of what truly mattered in life. "I understand," Mr. Harris said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your home sounds wonderful. Thank you for explaining." As the conversation concluded, Mr. Harris felt a deep respect for the Thompson family's decision. Their choice to remain in their modest home, despite having the means for something grander, spoke volumes about their character and values. In the weeks following his encounter with the Thompson family, Mr. Harris underwent a profound change. His newfound humility and desire to be more inclusive in his business practices didn't go unnoticed by his longtime business partners. One crisp morning, Mr. Harris arrived at his office to find an unexpected board meeting in progress. As he entered the room, the conversations hushed and all eyes turned to him. The atmosphere was tense, filled with an unspoken accusation. Harris, his senior partner, Mr. Jameson, spoke first. "We need to talk about the direction of this company." Mr. Harris took a seat, his heart pounding. He listened as his partners laid out their concerns. They spoke of falling property values, decreased exclusivity, and a tarnished reputation. Each word felt like a blow to Mr. Harris's chest. "Your new approach is costing us money," Mr. Jameson said bluntly. "We can't afford your sentimentality." Mr. Harris tried to defend his position, explaining the importance of diversity and inclusion. But his words fell on deaf ears. His partners saw his change of heart as a weakness, a liability to their bottom line. After a heated discussion, the verdict was clear. Mr. Harris was being forced out of the company he had built from the ground up. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He felt the room spin as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. As he packed up his office, his hands trembling, Mr. Harris thought about the financial implications. His wealth had been largely tied up in the company. Now, he faced significant financial loss. The comfortable life he had known was slipping away. But it wasn't just the money. As word spread about his ousting, Mr. Harris found himself shunned by many in his social circle. People he had considered friends for years now avoided his calls. Invitations to events dried up. The personal loss stung even more than the financial hit. As Mr. Harris grappled with the sudden upheaval in his life, he found himself at a loss. The once proud landlord now faced each day with uncertainty and fear. His comfortable world had crumbled, leaving him feeling lost and alone. One particularly gloomy afternoon, as Mr. Harris sat in his now quiet home, the phone rang. He almost didn't answer it, fearing another rejection or pitying call. But something made him pick up the receiver. "Hello?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Harris, it's Robert Thompson. I heard about what happened. Are you okay?" The concern in Robert's voice caught Mr. Harris off guard. He felt a lump form in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. I'm not sure," he finally managed to say. Robert's warm voice came through the line again. "Lisa and I were wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner tonight. No pressure, but we thought you might appreciate some company." Mr. Harris hesitated, then surprised himself by accepting the invitation. That evening, he found himself sitting at the Thompsons' modest but welcoming dining table. The aroma of home-cooked food filled the air, and the chatter of the Thompson boys provided a comforting background noise. As they ate, Robert and Lisa gently encouraged Mr. Harris to open up about his struggles. Their kindness and genuine concern touched him deeply. "You know, Mr. Harris," Lisa said softly, "sometimes life throws us curveballs to teach us important lessons. This is just a bump in the road. You'll get through this." Robert nodded in agreement. "And you're not alone. We're here to help in any way we can." Mr. Harris felt tears welling up in his eyes. The warmth and support from this family he had once rejected were overwhelming. For the first time since his world had turned upside down, he felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it." The Thompsons assured him that everyone deserves kindness and second chances. They encouraged him to stay positive and offered their assistance in any way he might need. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Harris found himself at a crossroads. The loss of his company and wealth had left him feeling adrift, but the kindness of the Thompson family had planted a seed of hope in his heart. He knew he needed to find a new purpose, something that would allow him to make amends for his past mistakes and contribute positively to his community. One day, while browsing the local newspaper, Mr. Harris's eyes fell upon an advertisement for a job opening at the community center. They were looking for someone to help coordinate volunteer efforts and outreach programs. Without hesitation, he decided to apply. To his surprise and delight, Mr. Harris was offered the position. It was a far cry from his former role as a wealthy landlord, but as he stepped into the bustling community center on his first day, he felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. The job was simple but rewarding. Mr. Harris found himself organizing food drives, coordinating after-school programs for underprivileged children, and helping to set up job fairs for those in need. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities to make a difference in people's lives. As he worked alongside volunteers from all walks of life, Mr. Harris began to see the world through a different lens. He listened to stories of struggle and triumph, of hardship and hope. The diversity of the community he once shunned now became a source of strength and inspiration for him. One of his favorite tasks was organizing diversity workshops and equality seminars. Mr. Harris threw himself into researching and planning these events, determined to help others avoid the mistakes he had made. He shared his own story of transformation, hoping it would inspire others to examine their own biases and prejudices. As the weeks turned into months, Mr. Harris found a deep sense of fulfillment in his new role. The smile on a child's face when they received a warm meal, the gratitude in a job seeker's eyes when they found employment, the camaraderie among volunteers working towards a common goal. These moments filled his heart with joy. He often thought back to his conversation with the Thompsons, realizing that this bump in the road had indeed taught him invaluable lessons. His life was simpler now, but it was rich with purpose and meaning. As the seasons changed, the Thompson boys became regular fixtures at the community center. Ethan, Noah, Jacob, and Caleb would often stop by after school, eager to lend a hand and learn from Mr. Harris's experiences. Mr. Harris's face would light up every time he saw the boys walk through the door. Their energy and enthusiasm were infectious, bringing a new vitality to the center's activities. Ethan, the oldest, took a particular interest in the job fairs. He would help Mr. Harris set up booths and greet job seekers, his natural charm putting nervous applicants at ease. Noah, with his artistic flair, volunteered to create colorful posters for upcoming events, brightening the center's walls with his creations. Jacob, always full of energy, was a whirlwind of activity during food drives. He'd race around, organizing donations and packing boxes with lightning speed. Caleb, the youngest, had a gentle way with the smaller children who came to the after-school programs. He'd sit patiently, helping them with their homework or reading them stories. Mr. Harris marveled at how each boy brought their unique talents to the center. He saw in them the values their parents had instilled: kindness, humility, and a genuine desire to help others. One afternoon, as they were cleaning up after a particularly busy day, Mr. Harris paused to watch the boys. Ethan was showing Noah how to properly fold the tables, while Jacob and Caleb were sweeping the floor, turning it into a game to see who could collect the most dust. "You boys are a true blessing," Mr. Harris said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what we'd do without you here." The boys beamed at him, their faces glowing with pride. "We love helping out, Mr. Harris," Ethan replied. "It feels good to make a difference." Mr. Harris nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He thought back to the day he had rejected their family's rental application, ashamed of his past prejudices. Now these same boys he had once sought to exclude were bringing so much joy and purpose to his life. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. Harris found himself settling into a rhythm at the community center. The simple life he now led was a far cry from his days as a wealthy landlord, but he discovered a richness in it that he had never known before. Every morning he would wake up early, brew a pot of coffee, and walk to the center. The familiar faces he passed on the street would greet him warmly, and he'd respond with a genuine smile. It was a stark contrast to the aloof nods he used to give when he was focused solely on his business empire. At the center, Mr. Harris immersed himself in the daily activities. He helped organize literacy classes for adults, assisted in job search workshops, and even started a small vegetable garden in the back lot. The work was hands-on and sometimes tiring, but it filled him with a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. One day, as he was tending to the tomato plants, Mrs. Johnson, an elderly regular at the center, approached him. "Mr. Harris," she said, her eyes twinkling, "I never thought I'd see the day when you'd have dirt under your fingernails." Mr. Harris chuckled, looking down at his soil-stained hands. "Neither did I, Mrs. Johnson, but I must say, I quite enjoy it." They chatted for a while about the garden and the upcoming community potluck. As Mrs. Johnson walked away, Mr. Harris realized how much he valued these simple interactions. In his previous life, He had kept people at arm's length, viewing relationships as mere business transactions. Now he found joy in these genuine connections. The community potluck was a perfect example of this new joy. Mr. Harris arrived with a dish of roasted vegetables from the center's garden. As he entered the bustling community hall, he was greeted by a chorus of hellos and warm smiles. Children ran around, their laughter filling the air, while adults chatted animatedly in small groups. Mr. Harris found himself drawn into conversations about everything from local sports teams to recipes for the best apple pie. He laughed more that evening than he had in years, feeling a sense of belonging that had eluded him in his previous life of wealth and status. As he helped clean up after the event, Mr. Harris caught sight of his reflection in a window. The man staring back at him looked happier, more relaxed, and somehow younger than the stern businessman he used to be. He realized that in losing his fortune, he had gained something far more valuable: a community, genuine friendships, and a sense of purpose. As the weeks passed, Mark Harris couldn't help but notice the profound changes in his father. The once stern and unapproachable Mr. Harris had transformed into a man filled with warmth and compassion. Mark felt a surge of pride every time he saw his father interacting with the community members at the center. One sunny afternoon, Mark decided to surprise his father with a visit to the community center. As he approached, he saw Mr. Harris kneeling in the garden, patiently showing a group of children how to plant seedlings. The sight brought a lump to Mark's throat. "Dad," Mark called out, waving as he walked over. Mr. Harris looked up, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Mark, what a pleasant surprise." He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. Mark embraced his father, not minding the soil that transferred to his own clothes. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Mr. Harris beamed with pride as he showed Mark around the center, introducing him to the regulars and explaining the various programs they were running. Mark listened intently, his heart swelling with admiration for his father's dedication. As they sat on a bench outside, enjoying the late afternoon sun, Mark turned to his father. "Dad, I just want you to know how proud I am of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The way you've embraced this new chapter in your life, it's inspiring." Mr. Harris's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He reached out and squeezed Mark's hand. "Thank you, son. Your support means more to me than you know." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, both reflecting on how far they had come. Their relationship, once strained by Mr. Harris's rigid beliefs and Mark's struggle to connect with him, had blossomed into something beautiful and strong. "You know," Mr. Harris said softly, "I used to think success was measured by wealth and status. But now I realize that true success is found in the connections we make and the lives we touch." Mark nodded, feeling a deep sense of connection with his father. "I couldn't agree more, Dad, and you're touching so many lives here." As they continued to chat, sharing stories and laughing together, both father and son felt grateful for this newfound closeness. Their relationship had been transformed, just as Mr. Harris himself had been, and they both looked forward to the journey ahead, side by side. As the weeks turned into months, the community began to take notice of Mr. Harris's remarkable transformation. The once aloof and stern landlord had become a fixture at the community center, his dedication to promoting equality and helping others shining through in everything he did. People who had once whispered about Mr. Harris's prejudices now spoke of him with respect and admiration. They saw how he worked tirelessly, organizing events that brought people of all backgrounds together, and how he treated everyone with kindness and dignity. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly resident who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, remarked to her friend one day, "You know, I never thought I'd see the day when old Mr. Harris would be the heart of this community. But just look at him now." Indeed, Mr. Harris could often be seen chatting with residents from all walks of life, listening to their stories and offering support where he could. He organized food drives for those in need, set up mentorship programs for at-risk youth, and even started a community garden where people could grow fresh produce together. The Thompson boys, Ethan, Noah, Jacob, and Caleb, became regular volunteers at the center, inspired by Mr. Harris's commitment. They would often bring their friends along, spreading the message of unity and acceptance throughout their school. One day, as Mr. Harris was helping to set up for a multicultural festival at the center, he overheard two teenagers talking. "Man, Mr. Harris is so cool," one said. "Remember how everyone used to be scared of him?" "Yeah," the other replied. "Now he's like the grandpa everyone wishes they had." Mr. Harris felt a warmth spread through his chest at these words. He realized that his journey of personal growth had not only changed him, but was also having a ripple effect on the entire community. As the festival began, Mr. Harris stood back and watched as people from all backgrounds mingled, laughed, and shared their cultures. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had played a part in bringing this diverse group together. Mr. Harris stood in the bustling community center, his eyes gleaming with excitement as he surveyed the colorful decorations adorning the walls. Banners proclaiming "Celebrating Our Diversity" hung from the ceiling, and tables laden with dishes from various cultures lined the perimeter of the room. He had spent weeks planning this event, determined to make it a celebration of unity that the town would never forget. As people began to filter in, Mr. Harris greeted each one with a warm smile and a handshake. He watched with joy as families of different backgrounds mingled, sharing stories and laughter. The air was filled with the tantalizing aromas of foods from around the world and the melodious sounds of diverse music. When the Thompson family arrived, Mr. Harris's face lit up. He hurried over to greet them, his arms outstretched. "Robert, Lisa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much for coming. You're our guests of honor tonight." Robert clasped Mr. Harris's hand firmly. "We wouldn't have missed it for the world, John," he said, using Mr. Harris's first name with the ease of a close friend. Lisa added, her eyes twinkling, "This is wonderful. Look at how many people have come." Indeed, the community center was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds chatted animatedly, their faces alight with joy and curiosity. The Thompson boys, Ethan, Noah, Jacob, and Caleb, quickly dispersed into the crowd, eager to join their friends and help with the festivities. As the evening progressed, Mr. Harris took to the small stage set up at one end of the room. He tapped the microphone, and a hush fell over the crowd. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice ringing clear and strong. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This event is about more than just good food and music. It's about celebrating the rich tapestry of our community." He paused, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the Thompsons. "I'd like to give a special thanks to the Thompson family. Their kindness and forgiveness taught me the true meaning of community and acceptance. They showed me that our differences are not something to fear, but something to celebrate." A round of applause erupted, and Mr. Harris felt his heart swell with gratitude. As he stepped down from the stage, he was enveloped in a sea of handshakes, hugs, and words of appreciation. The event was more than just a success, it was a turning point for the entire community. As the community event wound down, Mr. Harris found himself sitting at a table with the Thompson family. The center had quieted, with only a few people milling about, cleaning up. The warmth of the evening's success still lingered in the air. Robert Thompson raised his glass of lemonade. "To new beginnings and true friendship," he said, his eyes twinkling. Everyone at the table clinked their glasses together, smiling broadly. Mr. Harris felt a lump in his throat as he looked around at the faces of those who had become so dear to him. Lisa leaned forward, her kind eyes fixed on Mr. Harris. "John, we can't thank you enough for organizing this event. It's brought the whole community together in a way I've never seen before." Mr. Harris shook his head humbly. "I should be thanking you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your family showed me what really matters in life. You taught me the value of compassion and humility." Ethan, the oldest Thompson boy, chimed in. "Mr. Harris, remember when we first started helping at the community center? You were so nervous about everything." Everyone laughed, including Mr. Harris. "Oh, I was a mess," he admitted. "But you boys were so patient with me. You taught this old dog some new tricks." Noah, the second oldest, grinned. "And now look at you. You're like the heart of the community center." As they continued to chat and laugh, sharing stories and jokes, Mr. Harris felt a profound sense of contentment wash over him. He looked at the Thompsons, Robert's wise smile, Lisa's gentle eyes, and the boy's youthful enthusiasm, and marveled at how much his life had changed. Here he was, sharing a simple meal with people he once would have shunned, feeling richer than he ever had when he was wealthy. The laughter around the table was more valuable than any property he had ever owned. The warmth in his heart was worth more than all his past business successes combined. Can a simple lifestyle bring more happiness than wealth and luxury? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel. I am spending hours upon hours writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support is what keeps me going.